Hi, we just need to resolve a couple of technical difficulties and we'll get started. I know you can't wait. All right, we're gonna get started. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. My name is Ayantu Tebeso, and I'm the outgoing OSA secretary, and I am going to moderate this panel titled "Being and Becoming Oromo: Contemporary Narratives." This is a panel that I'm really passionate about. Each of the people sitting here have interesting stories, and each of them, I think, demonstrate both the complexity, the richness, and the depth of the experiences of Oromos in the diaspora. And that is what I hope you get from it today. And then we talked about dedicating this panel to Kue Kumsa, really who needs no introduction. If you haven't heard of Kue, you need to Google her, get to know her, read her work. She's influenced us a great deal, and she's a model for us. Our first panelist is Zakia Palzi. Dr. Zakia Palsi recently completed a dissertation about Oromo institution building in the diaspora, particularly in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Her research interests include Oromo transnationalism and intergenerational issues of identity. Soreti Kadir, whom you have already heard from, is a phenomenal artist and writer, and someone who really inspires all of us a lot. Siadega Machisa is a community media designer and developer. She has worked throughout the world with communities on media ownership issues, as well as teaching about and building and creating independent media. Our final panelist is Hawit Alaun. She's a student at Macalester College, majoring in international studies and political science with African studies concentration. She's originally from Ethiopia and currently resides in Minneapolis. And with that, we will get started with our first panelist, Zakia.
Okay, how about now? Yeah, okay. Hello, everyone. The title of my paper, I'm not going to use a PowerPoint. It's I'm going to just speak from my notes. So the title of my paper is Oromuma 2.0, The Contours of Transnational Oromo Identity Among the Second Generation. In this paper, I outline some of the ethnic sentiments and characteristics associated with the second generation of Oromos living in North America. This paper is very preliminary, and it is based on a new project I started this summer that grew out of my dissertation work. So now I just want to briefly talk to you about what my dissertation was on. So I conducted my dissertation research on Oromo ethnic institution building in Washington, D.C. and its environs. It focused on the challenges Oromos faced in the area concerning institution building, maintaining their identity, and economically and politically impacting the homeland in Oromia. In Washington, D.C., it was first-generation immigrants that came during the 1970s through the 1990s that established the city's ethnic institutional landscape. So the Oromos that came during the 70s and up to the early 90s were the first Oromos to establish organizations in the city. They established organizations like the Oromo Center, the Oromo Community Center, and the area churches. Most of those I interviewed for my research and most of those that I observed for the project were highly educated Oromo men, for the most part, over the age of 40, from the central and western parts of the country. Also, most of them were asylees versus refugees. So the population here was a bit more educated and from the center and western part of the countries. And it was necessary to interview this population in order to understand how the community organizations and institutions came about. These men and women were the diaspora's discourse producers and institution builders. However, my dissertation project did not deal with a large segment of the Oromo population. So it did not, I did not interview a large number of Muslims or women or young people. So in order for me to write a more comprehensive account of the Oromo in the future, I need to take into account Muslims, women, and young people, and refugees in my future work. So as a result, I decided to start interviewing Oromo youths to fill in some of these holes. So this paper will be about the second generation. The Oromos of the second generation will come to be the majority in North America in the next 20 years, and it's important to study this population if we want to understand the future of the Oromo in the diaspora. Okay, so in my interviews, I generally focused on 3 areas. I focused on the intergenerational transfer of Oromo culture during childhood and adolescence. Next, I focused on intergenerational conflict. And finally, I also asked my participants about the future of the second generation and the unique contribution that they could make to the Oromo struggle and the like. So I want to first start by just sharing a few stories and insights that I learned about intergenerational cultural transmission from those I studied. I didn't, my population size so far has not been a lot. It's been a couple of handfuls, so around 10. But I hope to gather maybe about 30 to 40 interviews. But again, this is just the beginning. So in terms of intergenerational cultural transmission, or the ways in which parents pass information to their children, these are some of the things that I found. There were a number of factors that were positively associated with the transmission of an Oromo consciousness and Oromuma to the second generation. Number 1, age of arrival. So the age of arrival played a major role in influencing the depth of Oromo identity participants retained. 2 male participants came during their adolescence or near adolescence, and they had very deep retention of Oromo identity in the diaspora, even decades after their arrival. The politicization of a Oromo child's family members also play a role in helping them to maintain Oromo identity in diaspora. So all of those I interviewed so far were the children of 1 or 2 parents who fled the country due to political pressure of varying degrees. In these instances, in the instances where their parents were top-level officials in Oromo organizations or deeply involved with Oromo movements, their children had high levels of Oromo consciousness. For instance, one Oromo young man sort of shared a story with me about, I guess his awakening. He was around 6 or 7, and he said that I always knew I was an Oromo, but when my father had to flee and move to Kenya, it was at this time that a vacuum was created in my life, and I realized that the vacuum was created because my dad was an Oromo. So even though he spoke Afan Oromo at home, he, practiced various traditions. It was at the time in which his father left that, he really became awakened to who he was. He said, I saw the harassment of my mom, who remained, and the disappearance of family members, all for being Oromo and speaking on and advocating for Oromo issues. So it is through memories and the stories told about the homeland that the past is transferred to future generations. Language used at home and the presence of Oromo parents in the home after school was also positively associated with Oromo children kind of maintaining their identities. Parents that adhered to the strict use of Afan Oromo at home led to higher language use. In addition, one participant remarked that at times parents have no choice but to work, and they may, the kids might be latchkey kids, and in those instances, sadly, other agents of socialization come into their environment, and there is competition, in terms of identity. Oromo institutional presence in the city of settlement. Those that I studied that came during the 80s, when the Oromo community was either non-existent or small, struggled with maintaining an Oromo identity, at least during their childhood years. For Oromos of the second generation that came during the 80s, they were kind of trailblazers. They came in an environment that was sort of like a ghost town as it relates to Oromo institutions. So as their families helped to build institutions in the diaspora, they lived in a space that did not always support the transmission of Oromo culture to the next generation in immediate and direct ways. Often, Oromos that came during this time entered into communities that lacked immigrants from the Horn of Africa altogether, or that were occupied. They didn't have anybody from the Horn of Africa. One participant remarked that as a kid, in an area totally lacking any Oromo presence, language and even the history of persecution was not necessarily enough to ensure the direct transmission of Oromo identity and culture maintenance. So language, though it's important, and even if your parents speak to you in Afan Oromo at home, if there's no other Afan Oromos, if there's no other Oromos in the environment for you to speak to, it's going to be a challenge, right? All children need a connection to some sort of group, and if that connection is lacking, it'll be difficult to for them to sort of latch on and stick to interacting and thinking always as an Oromo. Let's see, you kind of made me speed up. I'm trying to sort of skip over some things. Okay, let's just talk about another thing that was positively associated with identity maintenance. So everybody I spoke to expressed that it was because their parents took them to OSA, Oromo soccer, and because parents had, monthly meetings, even cookouts, just, dinners with each other, those things were very positively associated with the transfer of Oromo identity. So it was really interesting to see the kids here yesterday. It showed that, even now the process is continuing. So that was in every interview, all of them mentioned that they learned who they were, they learned about their history, they were able to network and interact with one another because they were able to, come to things like OSA, come to Oromo soccer, have monthly meetings with other Oromos in their environment. It was at things like Oromo Soccer that the children were able to sort of network, again, learn about their history, and oftentimes through those networking sessions, they devised and came up with ideas for their own organizations. Because we are short on time, I want to kind of skip through and kind of talk about intergenerational conflict and institutions. So, you know, being involved with the Oromo community for the last 10 years, I've interacted with a number of young people, and sometimes they would grumble about not being able to participate in Oromo organizations. However, when I actually did these interviews, I found that the issues were a bit more complex. The youth I talked to did not have major conflicts with their parents, but there was one area where many of those I spoke to expressed a different point of view than their parents. So they didn't disagree about the issues impacting the Oromos, but they had a different view about how the problems should be solved. So I just want to mention a few things. And this relates to this concept of Oromuma 2.0. Number one, when I asked the youth about the unique contributions that they could give to the Oromo struggle, many of them felt that they could use social media to mobilize and publicize Oromo issues. They didn't feel that there was a need for them to lead the struggle. They just wanted to support the struggle. So all of the youth I talked to expressed the need to support Oromo issues and support the Oromo back home, but not necessarily to be in leadership positions. They wanted to just support the Oromo. One quick story, if I can. Taken into consideration. So for instance, one young woman that I spoke to in Canada mentioned that they were able to establish an organization on their own that provided tutoring for young people. They took the kids on trips, they gave them, culture training, and all they needed from their parents was support. They wanted, parental support, but they had their own vision for how they wanted their organizations to look. The last, I guess, difference that I noticed was that all of the youth that I spoke to expressed a desire to participate in the Oromo struggle and to support Oromos back home in wider ways than was typical of their parents. They wanted to support Oromos back home through non-political means sometimes, meaning they wanted to volunteer in Ethiopia if they were in the medical profession or had technical skills. They wanted to contribute in that way. And to provide educational means. So they felt that change was basically one student said that, our parents think that the solution to Ethiopia, to the Oromo problem is going to be everyone going into the field and fighting. And they said that this is not going to be the way they contribute. So they want to contribute by using the capacity that they're building right now to work, for a better future in the ways that they can. So I think my time is up, so I'm just going to cut it short. If you have any other questions, you can ask it at the end. Okay, thank you.
Before I start, just wanted to acknowledge that there is an all-women's panel up here today, and I think that is worth really recognizing. I actually wanted to show a snippet of a documentary that I filmed when in Australia, but the link isn't on the PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to describe to you what the documentary was about and tell you a little bit about it. So in Australia, I'm the co-founder and directing manager of a community development organisation called In Our Own Words that focuses on working with the African diaspora, three key areas: self-awareness, decolonial thinking, and community empowerment. The In Our Own Words journey began initially with a one-off production, the In Our Own Words documentary. This documentary followed the narratives of three different individuals and families. One was an Eritrean man, second was a South Sudanese man, and third was an Oromo family. I think a lot of people may actually be familiar with them, Basa and Lelise. And then it went on to look at the experience of second generation young Africans that were living in the diaspora and how conversations about migration, about race, about placement and displacement differed amongst these two different generations. Essentially what I want to talk about today is the process of repositioning the Oromo within the diaspora to stand in a position that is most beneficial not only to themselves but also to their allies. I think for myself, filming the In Our Own Words documentary, it was throughout 2014, was when I first really began to understand what it meant to not only live as an ethnically African, in my case, Oromo in the diaspora, but to also live as a Black woman in the diaspora. Over the last 2 days, we have spoken a lot about Oromo people kind of centralizing themselves in conversations of struggle and not being able to look beyond themselves. I feel like that's a valid point, but at the same time, centralizing your struggle is almost a natural outcome of systematic marginalization, but it is something that does need to be unlearned in order to progress. Now, within the context of the diaspora, in order to truly reposition the Oromo, especially those who are a lot younger, conversations about identity and critical analysis about identity is essential. I'm going to speak mostly about my experience within the Melbourne context. Raised as a very patriotic Oromo all of my life, and then growing up and gradually accepting, embracing, and celebrating a Black identity was kind of the process. But what I felt was, as I began to move away, and when I say move away, I mean on surface level, as practical examples, my social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, began to kind of speak about things outside of Oromumma. I received what I felt like to be rooted in some kind of competitiveness because it was essentially backlash. For example, in 2013, at the beginning of 2013, I began work with one of the largest aid and development organizations in the world. And I had traveled to Malawi, came back to Australia, and a lot of my public profile was centered around issues of poverty, of child malnutrition in Malawi. And I was getting messages from Oromos from various different places asking me why I was talking about Malawians when Oromo people were also facing, different struggles. Same thing when talking about things like the Black Lives Matter movement in Australia. Same thing, in America. Same thing when talking about Indigenous Australians and the subjugation that they go through. And for myself, I feel like this is rooted in a type of fear, a fear that young people are slowly going to become somewhat disinterested in the Oromo cause, or become less passionate about the Oromo cause if they think about anything else. I know that is not going to be the case in any sense, and I think that we have gauged throughout OSA, throughout the last couple of years with the Oromo protest movement, the young people are far from becoming disengaged. They are becoming more and more disengaged with the Oromo cause and Oromo issues. Blackness and Oromumma are two things within my identity that are not mutually exclusive. They are intrinsic parts of who I am. And I don't feel like for me to embrace Blackness or talk about the Black struggle, which is something that I also face within the diaspora, disqualifies my Oromumma, as some very much so suggest. But that type of feedback that is essentially rooted in this kind of fear, is extremely restricting, not just for myself, but for our community, and is incredibly dangerous. It pushes young people away from being able to own and being able to express in whatever way they want a type of Oromo identity. Moving away from this and looking at repositioning the Oromo, there are kind of three reasons I think that it's really important that we do that. Really important that we create space within diasporic institutions to allow young people to have conversations that are not always solely focused on the Oromo identity, but things that can enhance a person's ability to actually have these conversations in a practical way, discourse, resources. And first and foremost is that when you are oppressed, there is the potential there for you to also become the oppressor out of this fear. And so when you deny a young person's opportunity to speak about a lived experience, you essentially become the oppressor, because this young person cannot vocalize how they feel, and then they internalize whether it's racism, whether it's inadequacy, because there is no room within their public spaces to actually have these conversations. The second thing is solidarity. I'll take the example of Indigenous Australians, and because I'm from Australia. So I don't know how many of you know much about Australia's history, but it is essentially a white settler colony that still functions as so today. And in the last couple of months, Indigenous people in Australia have faced extreme subjugation by the Australian government, Indigenous communities being closed down in some remote areas of the country, and huge protests have erupted across the country. I have not in an institutional level seen Australian Oromos taking on the responsibility of also bringing attention to this cause. When we as Oromos, Indigenous people in Ethiopia, share that common narrative with these same people in Australia. And that's a problem. I think it's a huge problem. And moving on to actually show solidarity with those such as Indigenous Australians, not only restores, in a sense, and maintains our humanity, but it also gives us the opportunity to learn from people. It also gives us the opportunity to capitalize off what we both go through, to be able to understand that struggles, although different, are shared experiences. The third is resources. So working within our own words, an organization only 9 months since its inception has now a huge following across Australia. After filming the In Our Own Words documentary, we have had a sequence of different events that have drawn magnitudes of people to. We've just launched our first sustainable program that focuses on African history. And towards the end of this year, we're looking at holding an international convention in Melbourne. Working within our own words, focusing on my art, building these networks have allowed more people than ever in my own sphere of people to know of Oromos, more so than they ever did when I just worked with Oromo people. And this is not me saying, use another struggle to gain access to whatever for yourself, but again, it goes back to sharing knowledge. It goes back to understanding shared struggles actually do make for better communities and stronger communities. As I said, my Blackness and my Oromo are not mutually exclusive. And I want to be able to continue to have the conversation about how our diasporic institutions like OSA, like OMN, like the Kubba, like Federation Square in Australia, which I know a lot of you guys are familiar with, can continue to, yes, preserve cultural knowledge, yes, act as incubators for young people to continue to understand Oromuma, but can also extend space for young people to come in and also talk about things that they face on a daily basis, that they are experiencing, whether that's racialization, whether that's lack of access to education, whatever it may be, because these conversations give young people the opportunity to understand that their voices matter. And then they will move closer to wanting to really align with the Oromo cause. And my time is officially up, so I'm going to stop there. But please feel free to ask questions as I do sit down. And all the details for In Our Own Words are up there. Unfortunately, I didn't get to show you guys a little bit of the documentary, but speak to me and I can make that possible. Thank you.
There we go. Okay, before beginning my presentation, I'd like to thank all the organizers of the OSA conference for their tireless work. A special thank you to our moderator, Ayantu Tebeso, for her intentionality in ensuring a platform for emerging voices at OSA such as this panel. I also want to take a moment to dedicate my presentation to my family, my parents, Rahel and Gemachisa, and my siblings, Wagari, Nati, and Galane. We made it through some difficult passages, and from our challenging beginnings, paving the way in isolation and without others to share our culture to the present, where we're surrounded by a vibrant and flourishing community. I hope I adequately speak for you all today. So today I'd like to briefly lead you through an exploration of the Oromo diasporic identity as experienced not only by myself, but as you will see later, many others who have left our homes, either forcefully or by choice. To do this, I'd like to explore and share with you the following topics: the necessity for multiple narratives and the danger of a single story, a personal account of migration and transition, the second, consciousness and hybridity, third, culture kids, a necessity for inclusion of multiple Oromo narratives, and the Safu Project. To begin, let's take a look at an incredible Nigerian writer who's influenced my thinking in recent years, so much as to lead me to pursue the concept of the danger of a single story. In a TED Talk a few years ago, Chimamanda Adichie spoke of the need for multiple narratives for ethnic groups in order to challenge inaccurate stereotypes of groups of people in literature, media, and most importantly, in our own minds. Adichie writes, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Please keep in mind Adichie's comments on the danger of a single story as we continue through the remaining ideas in this presentation, as this is the primer for all that will follow. To explore the intersectionality of our stories and the experience of diaspora, let's first take a look at Robin Cohen's definition of diaspora. Cohen writes, the word diaspora comes from the Greek word spiro, meaning to sow, and the preposition dia, meaning over. The word suggests networks of real or imagined relationships among scattered peoples whose sense of community is sustained by various communications and contacts, including kinship, trade, travel, shared culture, language, and ritual. For the purpose of my discussion today, I'm referring to diaspora in the context of Oromo's shared experiences of forcefully or voluntarily leaving our homeland, the traumas associated with such a dispersal, and the ways we make sense of our new existences outside of our homeland. Here are a few images which reflect the current state of the Oromo diasporic experience. We have community organizations, cultural and music events, political campaigns, media outlets, soccer tournaments, publications, and festivals for the youngest among us. When friends and family members arrive from back home now, often there's a well-established Oromo community to welcome the newcomer and assist him or her with their adjustment community. But as I mentioned earlier, it was not always this way. As Zakia spoke of the different staggered waves of Oromo migration in her presentation, my family's experience was very different from the more dominant narrative since we came to the States very early on, when there were very few others here and things were a lot different. In the spirit of Adichie, I'd like to share with you all a different narrative. A personal account. After my parents' first stint in the US in the 70s with my older brothers, they returned back to Dambidolo where I was born. Since I left only at the age of 5, people often ask me, what if anything do I remember from being back there? They usually expect an answer of not much, but I remember quite a lot. The heat of the sun at midday, the first air I breathed into my lungs, walking back from school for lunch in one of my favorite dresses. We then came